Welcome back to episode 5 of the CyberWire. I'm absolutely thrilled to invite Raffael Marty on. He is formerly running the cybersecurity practice at ConnectWise and has been an executive leader for some pretty well-known names in the security field, whilst also being advisor to a few VC firms and helping invest in cybersecurity startups. So, Raffi, I'll let you do the honors and maybe introduce yourself a little bit.
Of course, well, thanks for having me on. Really excited for the conversation here. As you said, I've been in cyber for, I don't dare to say it, but probably 25 years at this point. Been very lucky that I have been able to work from some really cool companies. Back in the day when I started out in my career, I actually grew up in Switzerland, as you might hear in my accent. I got the opportunity to work at IBM Research and get exposed to some very interesting things, and then ended up coming over to the US, where I lived in Silicon Valley for a while, and got into a startup. And at the time, I had no idea. I interviewed at this company, and I just had an amazing time even interviewing. I got out of there after 6 hours of straight interviews. I was exhausted, but I was telling my friends afterwards, I'm like, this was really cool. This is a conversation with people that understand me, and they were speaking the same language. And turned out the company with the startup I joined was called ArcSight, for people that might know it. We were like 40 people in a small office and grew to 300. The company went IPO at some point. So I was just very, very lucky along my career of what I've been able to do. From ArcSight, I ended up at Splunk, where I was one of the first, and not first, but among the first 70 employees, and the company grew like crazy. Super fun experience there. And tried myself at some startups, because I keep joking that if you live in San Francisco, at some point you have to start a company. It's a thing there, which was super fun, nerve-wracking at times, but learned a lot about the VC community and how do you raise money and how does that all work. Then ended up back in corporate America and had a couple of stints there at some companies. And yeah, I'm very grateful for the opportunities I had and for the people that took the risks on me. And it's been definitely a fun journey.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Raffi. And I think there's no doubt you've had an incredible career so far in the world of security. And it's like I say, you've worked for some pretty reputable names that many people will recognize. And you've seen some of them, as you've stated there. You've joined in those earlier stages. You've seen them grow to the big names that they are today. And obviously, you've been an executive leader. You've been a P&L owner. I suppose it'd be really interesting to start off with maybe digging into some of the biggest challenges that maybe yourself in those businesses, or just kind of the journey that those businesses have faced. What are some of the challenges that you've had to overcome?
Where to start? Let me pick one, and this is probably an important one. Looking at a company, probably at almost every size, at some point you want to understand what the company does. Be that like how many users are actually using my product, be that how much money do I make, if you have multiple products, which product is profitable, what are we really working on, where do we spend the time. So a lot of things come down to numbers, and you got to be able to collect those numbers. And it's very interesting to me how most companies I've worked for, there has been some kind of a gap in having even just the numbers available with regards to, hey, this is what's going on in the business, right? And I would definitely advise everybody, that anyone as a startup founder, start very clean, start doing these things correct from the beginning, and don't push it off too far. What then is interesting, so you're collecting numbers, you understand the business in a spreadsheet, right? But then you realize, the numbers, you can interpret them in a way, and they're trying to tell you a story, but it's not often clear what exactly the story is. Say you have a retention rate of 80%. So 80% of your customers will stay after a year, and then 20% drops off. Well, why? Well, then you can look at more data, and you're like, okay, I see that this segment here, they're dropping off. But then still there, it's like, why, right? And so you realize that the numbers are sort of this spotlight that helps you focus on where to go And then you have to go and understand your business. And that's sort of, I think, also what happened in my career. I'm an incredible, like I grew up as a geek. I still am a geek. If you can sort of see right here, there's a workbench here where I every now and then I have time, I tinker around with electronics. But um you realize that this is where it goes from the technical understanding to the business understanding, right? The business often comes from the numbers, but then you have to bridge it back to the details of what actually is happening in the business. Why do these customers leave, right? And that's where you have to somehow capture that information, or you have an idea of what's happening, right? Like, well, my page load times are just way too high, so users are not putting up with it, and they're leaving, and they're not putting up with us, and there's the competition, and so things are starting to come together, and then finally you have a picture of what the business is doing. And that, I think, for every single company, small or big, is one of the key things that you need to look at. So that's one of the challenges what I've seen. Sometimes you have a lot of numbers, but then still the narratives on why need to be explored. In certain areas of the business, you might have everything. In others, you might not even have the numbers. But that's one of the things that I've had to navigate pretty much everywhere, because no matter in what position you are, whether you're CEO or whether you're running a team, right? In the end, you have to somehow just justify what you're doing, even as an individual contributor. Maybe your manager is justifying it for you. But somehow you're part of a system that in the end, hopefully generates some revenue for a company, or some outcomes, or problem solved for a customer. And so that's been an interesting one that has its tentacles everywhere.
I can only imagine, and what I'm definitely hearing that there is for the spreadsheet lovers, Excel is still holds its value.
Oh my goodness, it's crazy. And how good I got in Excel, and how much is still being done in Excel. It's a very powerful tool. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but it's just interesting with a world with Gen AI and SaaS applications, that you don't have a system where you just load all this data into the Gen AI and just ask it questions like, hey, why is the business not doing well? Or where should we focus our resources? I'm sure that's in development with a lot of different companies. So
There we go. Who knew? Come on a podcast and we're creating new business ideas. This is we're going to pivot the direction, but no, well, and I think it's really interesting to hear that, and I suppose to maybe dive even deeper into this, because obviously, as you mentioned at the start, it's almost a rite of passage to give it a go founding a company, and that definitely presents its own challenges, but it naturally led you back into that corporate world where you've been able to build your career even more into that more executive leadership, but also really being embedded within the world of VC. And I'd be really interested to maybe understand what kind of either challenges have you faced, or how have you been able to get to this point in your career?
that's a lot. Uh,
Loaded question.
I definitely think luck plays a little bit of a role. But as people say, right, your own luck. What do they call it? Smith? No, what do you call it? In German, there's a saying like you're your own luck smith, or blacksmith, or whatever. I think some of the components, I think, that are true for me is I've always been a networker. I always loved meeting people. And I know it's kind of cliche. Everybody, oh, I got a network, whatever. But it needs to also come somewhat natural, right? It's not like you're going to RSA and you're going to one of the parties and you just talk to everybody, and like that's not going to work, because they might remember you a week later, but do they remember you a year later, right? Like, so networking is a thing that needs to come sort of natural through what you're doing. And that's the second piece. Lots of people ask me like, hey, how do you become an advisor, or how do you, like, first to a startup, and then maybe like, how do you become an advisor to a VC fund or something like that? And it's not like you get up one morning and you're like, oh, I'm just going to ask a bunch of VCs whether they need an advisor, right? It's about you're building yourself a certain area of expertise, and you bring some experience to the table, and that then sort of qualifies you, and then the doors start opening slowly, right? And bringing that together with the network that you've built, suddenly these things might show up, or you can create them, right? But what has always been true for me, and again, I've been lucky in a sense, and really grateful for the opportunities that have presented themselves to me. And as I mentioned, I've always been a geek. I mean, I ran websites back in the day. I was a system administrator. I built websites. I was always tinkering, doing stuff, and that way I built out my expertise, right? And so, and then at some point when I started working at ArcSight, I was just I loved what I was doing. And again, I was in a privileged situation that I had that. Um, but I jumped in, I did all these things, and I ended up finding an area that I was so interested in, which was data analytics and data visualization, because even back then, we had so much data, and we're like, what do we do? What is in here? What does it tell us? And we just didn't have the right tools. So it's like, what to do? Well, let's write some code. And so I hacked together some code and made it open source, and some people used it and provided feedback. And at some point, I was like, wow, there's so much information here. I could write a book about this. And so I wrote a book about it. And then with the book, I started speaking at the conferences. So it's this flywheel where you have the conversation, and suddenly it's like, oh, security visualization. There's this guy, I wrote a book about it, has some experience with it. And that's the key piece, right? It's like, it was not just like, oh, here's a couple of things that I read somewhere else. No, I played with things, I created stuff. And so I had something to tell and something new to show. And so that kind of, I think, is true across different areas, right? It's security visualization is not something I do much anymore, or not very many startups are interested in that. But because having gone through starting a company, having seen other companies, having had that experience, now people are asking me, hey, what do you think? And I can pull from that experience to say, hey, I've seen this go wrong. This seems about the same pattern here. Might want to look at it. Maybe there's something interesting here we should pursue, or maybe we should avoid these kinds of things, right? So putting the work in, but also maybe stepping back every now and then and saying, what am I passionate about, that you actually invest the extra time or interest to then become the expert, or become the authority that someone is going after to seek advice from.
Yeah, no, no. And it sounds like there's a few different key things that you're pointing out there. And obviously experience definitely sounds like one of them. And I'm always a firm kind of believer that networking is such a powerful thing when done right, and I think it's all about the authenticity element that you talk about there as well. And again, I want to kind of dive into a little bit more of something that I think you have a really unique perspective on, and you've already mentioned it there, but obviously over the past couple of years is where you've really taken a step into advising some VC firms, and some pretty well known ones that that they've got a good eye for some for some of the market leading startups within the security space. I think it'd be really interesting to maybe see from the past couple of years, what are some of the common themes that you have noticed are being looked at when it comes to investing in a new startup?
Um, the space is so dynamic, right? There's security is, in a sense, almost, and probably a lot of people will say, like, will tailor this to their own spaces, but I think it's one of the most complicated spaces, because we have to secure every single area of technology, right? Someone comes up with this crazy idea that there should be cloud computing. Well, great. Now we have to secure that stuff, right? Someone comes up with Gen AI. Now we have to secure that stuff. And by securing, you have to understand it. And so security is a really, really hard turf. Also, because it's not a revenue generating function generally, right? It is an insurance policy. And so it's one of the hardest things you can choose to go into security, especially then when you're trying to predict successful companies and outcomes in the end. Now, I keep saying I'm not a VC. I do not understand which companies are going to make it big. Like I look at companies, I'm like, really? I don't know. And then others I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then they don't go anywhere, right? That's why I'm advising these firms because I'm an incredibly good devil's advocate, right? Like I will look at things pretty critically and like, yeah, this is not going to work. Even if I say it's not going to work, the partnership might still say, yeah, but here to set up that makes sense. I'm like, sure, I could see that, right? Um, but often it's like, yeah, maybe that's not going to work out. But then, so what I've been seeing is, it hasn't really changed necessarily. I think the VC space has changed a lot in terms of, I mean, funding rounds. When I raised my Series seed, it was $250,000. Like maybe it was 500,000. My Series A was 4.2 million. Right today, your Series pre-seed is 2 million, and then your seed is 7 billion, and your A is like 20. It's crazy how this stuff has changed. The requirements are very different, right? But the fundamentals are still the same. It starts with a team, and this is I'm pretty sure pretty much every VC will tell you early stage. I mean, across the board, but early stage very very important. You want to have the right team that ideally has a background that lends itself to understanding a certain problem really well. A team that is hungry, a team that works well together, and that's actually interesting. The hungry piece is very important. You, in a startup, you don't have the luxury of sitting back and working 9 to 5 necessary, right? It's and you need to be in a situation where you're excited about what you do and you don't mind the long hours. And it doesn't mean you have to work 24 hours a day, right? But the I do know certain cultures in certain countries might get into the habit of, oh, yeah, we have a great business here and there's no urgency. There's always urgency in a startup, right? And you got to keep that. So that's something that a VC will look for, and that will actually show itself in the numbers as well, right? If you look at revenue, if you've been around for 6 years and you haven't made $1 million in ARR, it's like, well, why? What have you been doing? In certain spaces, hey, you have a lot of research and validation to do to get to something that you can sell, but in general, you will look for certain outcomes within a certain time, right? So the team is super important. Technology is important, right? Like, is it something that's defensible? And that's getting a little bit shaken up right now with Gen AI. Suddenly, everybody's a developer. I can write super fast. It's insane. And with that, you want to be aware that are you embracing that? Are you opposing it? And if you don't jump in the bandwagon, you're going to be rolled over pretty quickly. So how do you embrace that? What are you actually building, right? Is there a defensible component to that in whatever way, shape, or form? Maybe the technology is not, but maybe your market is defensible or something like that. But those are, especially early on, that is very, very important. And then the further down you go with the company, the more it's about numbers. It's about the financials. It's about looking at, hey, are you growing? What are you doing? Where are you? Why haven't you sold more? How fast are you growing, right? And again, if you look at some of the statistics right now with these new Gen AI startups or startups that are using Gen AI, it's insane. Like the 0 to 10 million in 6 months and stuff like that. That's just unheard of. It's amazing, right? Those companies obviously get a lot of interest, but then it's also a question: can they sustain something like that? So at the later stage, it's a lot about, okay, we have a tech. How do we bring that to market, right? Like, what is my market? Where do I sell? What's my customer profile? And there's something, and I work with these startups often. It's like really understanding your ideal customer profile, your ICP. Like, where do you sell? How do you sell in there? How do they buy, right? What are the uniquenesses? That is very, very important. That's something I spent the last 4 years looking at the MSP space. And even when I say MSP, managed secure service providers, people have very different understanding of what that means. And so defining what that is, which ones are you targeting, and so on. So I think that's some of the fundamentals that you have to be aware of when you're trying to go to an investor or when you're building a company, that you have some of those components together.
Yeah, no, for sure, and I think it's always a challenging one, isn't it? It's a tough space to. Everybody knows it's not the easiest thing in the world to get series funding, but it's always really valuable to know, what is it that helps you kind of stand out, I suppose, and maybe to kind of flip that a little bit, because I think it's really easy to look at, okay, like what do we look for, but what about the other side of that? What about what sometimes stands out on the negative? Are there ever any things that kind of that'll come forward and it'll just be like, actually, this is telling us that this isn't going to work. This is a bit of a no go.
Um, I think often as a startup, you have an initial idea and you're like, oh, there's a problem here that I can solve. Sometimes it is not clear either in the pitch or the company is not even clear on it. What's the problem you're actually solving? It sounds like it's a cool technology, but where's that problem in the market? I like what you're doing, but is anyone going to pay for this? Right? Because the nice to haves, people don't have budget for them.
Yeah.
Then you can look at the plan. So sometimes when you have a founding team, how does a team work together? And sometimes you see that it's like, even in the say they do a presentation to the VC, the partnership, they step on each other's toes, they kind of contradict each other, or kind of like they're not showing up as a team, right? And that also means that one person is talking the whole time and the other is just kind of sitting there. It's like, are you really a team in this? Right. So see the dynamic of the team. And then are they able to, or it's not just even in the pitch, but it's also just as the company, are you able to articulate a clear plan on what your product or service is going to do? And I literally just had a conversation yesterday with a founder where they struggled, the founding team, the two of them, they struggled to get on the same page of exactly what they were going to do. One thought, oh, we need this set of features. The other thought this, that set. They thought they understood each other, and then they built something that was like halfway in between somewhere. So getting very clear between the two people, or the company as a whole, what are we building, right? And it sounds easy, but it's not, because we're dealing with humans,
Yeah.
right? Because the communication is hard. I say something, you hear it in a certain way.
Yeah.
You have all kinds of biases and things. It's like, oh yeah, I got you. Don't worry. Like, oh, maybe you didn't, right? Did you really hear me? And that's hard. That's really hard. And it's not a cliche. It's a thing, right? And so that's something else that get really, really clear what you're building, what the company's about.
Yeah.
Those are a couple things that I can think of.
No, definitely. Again, all really helpful. I think it really is a case that's not everybody gets the opportunity to get exposure into how the world of VC works, and sometimes if they do, it's only on one side. And I suppose we could kind of close off here, and I think kind of we've already touched base on the fact that so much in the security world has been changing, that whether we're talking about kind of, AI implementation, or whether we're just talking about the demand of the products that are coming out there, or how do you go about getting funding and all these different things, is an ever evolving landscape. But I'd be really interested to hear your predictions, Raffy, and maybe kind of a piece of advice that you'd offer to anybody, whether they're an executive in a startup, a founder, maybe what can they do to help take it to the next level, I suppose.
Look, I think there's all kinds of, let's call it technical or business advice that people will probably give. But in the end, and we just talked about it for a second, in the end, you're dealing with people on all the sides, right? You're dealing with people in the company, you're dealing with people on the other side of the table when you're selling things, you're dealing with it when you're getting funding. And I think that's something that also the pandemic has helped us realize a little more again, that it's just really important to not forget about the human aspect of things, right? Like, I've been sitting in this office for many, many years now. I've done remote work before the pandemic already, but it is so important that you have in-person time. It's just different, right? Because I'm speaking to the screen every day, all day long, and there's just different faces popping up. Yes, of course, there's some kind of a relationship or a connection that you have with the other side, but it's not the same as in person, right? Um, but overall, it's important who you surround yourself with, no matter where you are, right? If you're a solo entrepreneur and you're building your own thing, if you're working in a company, who's your team, um, you want to be surrounded by good people, right? You want to have some fun with that. So, and in a company, if you can steer, if you hire people, surround yourself with good people, right? Um, then the other thing that I'm seeing is that I want to say be humble. It's, everybody has their own career path and their own experiences, and they might be different from you. And if you can show up in a humble way and ask questions and explore, often you land better than coming in like, oh, I know everything already. And that's something that we're all constantly learning, right? Nobody knows everything. And so being able to leverage the relationships you have or that you're exposed to and learning from that is a gift, right? And we should treat it as such. And I think that's just, again, emphasizing the human element of what we're doing. It's just so important. Again, I could talk about all kinds of other things in business and whatever, but I think that really is what it comes down to. Like I give you an example. Like I was looking at a company and I was talking to them. I get their pitch. They're telling me about what they're doing, and I quickly go on LinkedIn. I'm like, oh, I know someone that worked there before. I know someone that's a distributor of their product. I know someone that ran research for them before. Oh, I know someone that's connected to their CEO. I have this whole network of people that I'm friends with, and I make a couple of calls. My relationships, they come back with information that I would never have gotten anywhere else, right? So creating these relationships, showing up as you, whatever that means for you, right? Is an incredible asset that will serve you your whole life and not just for one job.
For sure. No, I think closing off with some really valuable insight there, Raffy. And again, I think a lot of this all circles back to that networking piece and your reputation in the market is really valuable. Especially when it comes to trying to, whether you're trying to get to a position like you are or whether you're trying to grow your business. There's no doubt. I always say cybersecurity is a huge world, but it's not. It's a really small world. So but well, Raffy, thank you so much for taking the time to join on. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast today, and yeah, thank you very much.
Likewise, thanks for having me on.